Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Okay, so this episode is the final part of the Green Day and Oasis arc, and this episode showcases the fight between Bruchardi and Oasis, and Seko, and it just showcases them fighting, and also we finally learn who this mysterious ally that they've been trying to find actually is. We actually find out what his name is in this episode, and I'll get to that because I wound up a prediction I had wound up being right, but in any case, the episode opens up with a recap of the fact that Bruchardi had to lead Oasis and Seko away from the helicopter until he could actually find a way to deal with Oasis, and of course it's at this point where they're actually in a street far away from where the fight against Green Day is actually taking place. At which point Seko emerges from the dirt, and of course, at this moment where they quickly realize where it seems like they're about to face off, and Seko even points this out, pointing out the net that Bruchardi thought he could hide from him, but now he's finally been able to close the gap between the two of them, and but it's at this point where they're actually looking around, and then they quickly realize that there's no longer any mold. And of course, sure enough, we then see paramedics just going around the city, just going around Rome and just scooping up anybody who might possibly be injured, or worse. And of course, Bruchardi quickly points out that that whatever happened, Mista and Giorno must have dealt with the mold, and it's of course at this point where Seko gets another voicemail, asking, in the voicemail we find out that Chocolata actually did send one last message about how asking if Seko had actually dealt with Bruchardi yet. And it points out that he's actually about to deal with Mista and Giorno right now, but that he's actually recuperating from an unfortunate blow to the head. So unfortunately it seems like things aren't going his way, but he does point out that he will defeat them if it kills him. And then the voicemail ends, and of course everybody is obvious, and of course he also then proceeds to point out in his voicemail that obviously he knows that there's some sort of secret power. He explains how they're going to go meet somebody in the Colosseum, and he's since figured that out, and is telling Seko to go and investigate the mystery of who this mysterious ally is on his behalf. I'm pointing out that obviously it's powerful enough to actually defeat the boss, and obviously they want it and they need to go find it. So and with that, the voicemail then ends, and initially Seko seems very choked up about the fact that Chocolata has died, but then what we find out is that no, he's not. As it turns out, his personality then does a complete flip-flop. And he then proceeds to reveal that he apparently doesn't really give much of a shit about Chocolata, like, at all. As we quickly find out, he only hung out with Chocolata because he thought he was strong. And also points out that obviously he gave him head pats, he gave him snacks, he gave him a whole bunch of other things. And the only reason he followed Chocolata around is because he did all of those things. And on top of that, he was strong and felt like he was somebody he could throw his lot in with and follow behind. But then points out that obviously it seems like Chocolata was weak after all, and then proceeds to use Oasis to turn Chocolata's camera into just a big melted mess. And with that, he then proceeds to point out that obviously he doesn't need to listen to Chocolata's words anymore, and that he's going to figure out this whole situation by himself. And of course, he then proceeds to make a beeline for the Colosseum, which Bruchardi quickly realizes from the phone call that obviously it seems like Seko knows what's going on, and quickly realizing it would be bad if Oasis got to the Coliseum and started melting the pavement. Specifically pointing out that Oasis seems like a very dangerous stand to be doing that. He then quickly realizes that obviously makes them a lot more dangerous of the two, because obviously if he sinks everything into the ground, it's going to cause mass danger and damage. And realizing he can't let that happen, he then proceeds to grab a nearby what is it called? He grabs a nearby light post and then proceeds to hurl it at Chocolata, not Choco, but Secco, and he just barely misses. He winds up hitting a statue, which of course Secco stops to gawk at and points and asks if that's the best that Bucciarati can do. But it's at this point where it's eventually he realizes that Bucciarati actually used his sticky fingers to actually split it in half with a zipper, which then almost takes Secco's head off. And he quickly realizes, and of course Secco quickly realizes that he'll need to retaliate against Bucciarati, and immediately gets into a fight with him. And of course what we find out, and that's and Secco even points this out, is that obviously Bucciarati has since realized that he's not going to be much match for Oasis in a fight. So what he does is he just kind of bounces around, swings around the pole and tries to hit him from the pole, But of course, it's at this point Secco does indeed point out that obviously Bucciarati has realized that his sticky fingers is not going to be much of a match against him in Oasis, and does point out that obviously he now realizes that he's not going to be able to win in a fair competition, but does point out that obviously Bucciarati is getting in the way of him going to find out who their mysterious ally is and defeating him. So he remarks that he can't really let Bucciarati live, and tries to go for a punch. But it's at this point where Bucciarati uses Sticky Fingers' zipper ability to split the pole in half, so he can avoid the punch, and then goes for a flurry of blows to try and hit Secco. But Secco just kind of knocks him into a window, and he gets covered in glass. And of course, it's at this point where Secco actually walks over to him, and once again takes note of his weird physical condition. Noting that obviously he thought first and foremost he gloats over the fact that Bucciarati is still unable to actually face him in a fair fight, but and does proceed to point out that obviously Bucciarati is not going to be able to defeat him in close quarters combat, but also then proceeds to point out that obviously Bucciarati is full of glass. And points out that he should very much be injured right now. But then, as Secco then proceeds to trail off when he notices a glinting coming from the Coliseum, and quickly recognizes it to be a pair of binoculars. And of course, to keep himself hidden, the mysterious ally then proceeds to tuck himself behind a column, which of course Secco notices and comments on, and points out that the mysterious ally is obviously very much there, and points out that that's most likely the person that they're going to try and go see, and also remarks that he noticed a pair of binoculars, a similar glint earlier, and deduces that it was likely a pair of binoculars, and points out that obviously the mysterious ally seems to have been keeping an eye on them from a distance, so that and tries not to intervene in the fight unless he absolutely has to. But Casey then proceeds to point out that he needs to go find out who this mysterious ally is in order to find out the secret that he's carrying, and then proceeds to declare that the secret will be his when he goes in to punch Bucciarati. But by this point, Bucciarati has actually picked up the pane of glass that had fallen out of the window when he hit it, and proceeds to use Sticky Fingers. And he uses to conceal the fact that to conceal his escape with Sticky Fingers, and Bucciarati then proceeds to escape into the ground. And of course, Secco immediately quickly realizes what's going on once after he actually notices Bucciarati's zipper on the ground, and points out that it's useless to actually hide from him, pointing out that obviously Oasis, the way Oasis works is that he's able to sense where people are underground and be able to move around underground freely. But when he realizes that Bucciarati actually isn't hiding but moving, he quickly realizes that he needs to actually chase after Bucciarati, and also becomes very upset over the fact that Bucciarati has copied him. He very much points out that obviously hiding underground and moving freely through the grounds is his trick. and he openly points out that he doesn't find it very funny that Bucciarati is copying him. So he declares that for that he's going to outright kill him. And sure enough, it then becomes a race through underground to the Coliseum, where Bucciarati is actually using sticky fingers to open zippers for him to repeatedly crawl through so he can get to the Coliseum. Well, but as he's doing that, he actually hears a noise. And of course, he remarks that sound actually travels a lot better in a liquid than in a solid. And of course, he does point out that he's hearing a very strange sound. And eventually deduces that it's Secco chasing after him. And sure enough, Secco is currently swimming through the grounds with his Oasis, and is currently on his way to try and stop Bucciarati from actually getting there. And what we find out is that Secco has a very accurate read on where Bucciarati currently is. So he even points out and even gloats about it, pointing out that obviously Bucciarati has quickly found out he's been cornered, and quickly points out that he's not going to be able to hide for very long, and proceeds to just count down all the meters between the two of them as he gloats and closes the distance between him and Bucciarati. But what we find out is that when he finally gets there, he discovers that Bucciarati has actually broken a pipe to actually trick Secco into chasing that. And Secco is obviously a little annoyed and actually winds up punching the pipe to actually stop it from dripping and making noise. But he then proceeds to point out that obviously if Bucciarati is sticking to some sort of to a tactic like this, then he must really be desperate and must really be cornered. And then proceeds to point out that Bucciarati seems to have the advantage for now, but he's about to take away his advantage. And sure enough, he then proceeds to surface, and then proceeds to reveal a hidden ability that Oasis enables him to do. It is obviously established earlier that Secco actually has great spitting ability, and he winds up using that ability in full force here. Because he then proceeds to use Oasis to scoop liquid pavement into his mouth and then start spitting it. And of course Bucciarati quickly is staying very still so that Secco doesn't hear him. But then the pavement actually starts raining down on him, and he winds up getting hit with large spikes of pavement. And of course, this is how Secco explains it. The way Secco explains it is that Oasis turns any liquid or otherwise that touches him, any solid that touches him or otherwise, and turns it into a liquid. And then the second it breaks contact, it turns back into a solid again. And the way Secco is explaining it is that because he's eating liquid pavement and then spitting it out. It's raining down raining down spikes of pavement on Bucciarati's location, and he ultimately does gloat a little bit to Bucciarati, because pointing out that obviously Bucciarati shouldn't move, because if he does, then he'll wind up getting hit, and then Secco will know where he is. But also points out that mentions that there was an instance of a death row inmate getting hanged 3 times and being very lucky every single time. And gloats that maybe Bucciarati will get lucky here as well. But Bucciarati, of course, tries to stay still, although his body is getting bombarded with spikes, and obviously he has a durability limit on his body. Obviously he doesn't really feel any of this, because as he explains, he's basically a zombie at this point. But it's still very much damaging his body and hindering his ability to fight back. So yeah, he's kind of on borrowed time, so obviously any hits he takes will wind up very much killing him. But of course, when we then see the mysterious ally who is actually commenting on all of this, and points out that obviously he's seeing all of this, and points out that he does need to keep his distance, but also points out that if Bucciarati and his crew aren't able to make it, that he needs to destroy the arrow at all costs, pointing out that it shouldn't be able to fall into the wrong hands. And then he finally reveals what his identity is. And I wound up being right, because he then proceeds to recount how he went to Egypt many years ago and wound up finding the arrow on an exposition. And then what we find out is that it actually is indeed Polnareff. He's a lot older and is now wheelchair bound. He's about 35, I think. But he's older, wheelchair bound, and has prosthetic legs, and isn't able to move all that well. But yeah, he's still kicking around. I mean, obviously he's just been floating around in the background this whole time. Obviously, since his part ended, he left Joseph and Jotaro and just went off on his own. and he's just been floating around in the background, and now we finally know where he's been. He's been in Rome this whole time. But yeah, of course. But yeah, of course. He then proceeds to remark that he hopes that obviously he's been waiting a long time for somebody to actually come and give him his chance to actually defeat the boss, and points out that he's been waiting to give somebody the arrow, but once again points out that if Bucciarati isn't able to make it, that he will unfortunately have to destroy the arrow, but he hopes it won't have to come to that. Meanwhile, Bucciarati is still being bombarded by pavement spikes, and eventually he realizes that he can't take it anymore and that he needs to move, so he swats away a couple of them with sticky fingers and starts moving again. And of course, Secco immediately hears this and immediately falls after him, but does point out that Bucciarati isn't going to be able to escape, pointing out that obviously there's nowhere he can run when his Oasis can turn anything into pavement, anything into a liquid. And then proceeds to use his ability to just spread throughout the city, and of course he quickly chases after Bucciarati, but Bucciarati quickly comes up with a plan to try and distract Secco and keep him from actually coming after him, and sure enough, as Secco is actually trying to close the difference between him and between the two of them, Bucciarati then proceeds to break up a large a large light post. And it just rains unzippered pieces down on where Oasis currently is, and of course Secco points out that was a very neat trick, but it's not going to help him very much, and then proceeds to use his ability to just pull everything underground, and yeah, and this does wind up working. It starts causing things to just rain into the ground and be absorbed and floating around freely, and what we quickly find out is that because of this. Oasis actually reveals that it has a kind of an ability that would cause Bucciarati some problems, and reveals that Bucciarati's ability is actually starting to melt, and this is actually revealed as just an extension of Oasis's ability. That obviously Secco is using his Oasis to just turn everything into a liquid. It makes sense that Bucciarati's body would actually start breaking down as well, And of course, Bucciarati quickly realizes that he's in danger, and starts seeing a bunch of free-floating objects floating around him, including a car, a lamppost, and a couple of other things. And Oasis finally is able to close the distance between the two of them, and Secco then proceeds to gloat to Bucciarati that obviously the closer he gets, the more powerful his ability is going to be. And points out that obviously Bucciarati isn't going to be able to run away from him anymore, and is then prepared to actually go in and throw a punch, declaring that the secret of the Colosseum will be his. But then Bucciarati quickly reveals that this was actually what he was waiting for all along. And sure enough, does proceed to point out that obviously his body is indeed breaking down, it is indeed falling apart, and he's very much on borrowed time, but does point out that does lend him some advantages that Secco isn't able to take advantage of. Namely, that he can actually take several bits of damage that Secco isn't able to take, and then proceeds to actually go in and punch a tire as hard as he can from the car that fell in, and of course points out that obviously Bucciarati is going to be able to be perfectly fine, because obviously his eardrums are most likely going to burst, but he'll be fine, because obviously he's not really using them much anyway. But does point out that obviously Secco is relying on his hearing a lot more than Bucciarati is, and tells Secco that he should probably cover his ears, though it's probably not going to help much. And sure enough, after Bucciarati delivers his speech, he then proceeds to burst the tire, and it just makes a loud shockwave that just echoes through the dirt. And of course, Secco's ears immediately start bleeding, and he quickly starts panicking a little bit, because obviously his eardrums just burst. That would hurt like hell. I can only imagine. But of course, it's at this point where Bucciarati explains what he was waiting for, about how he was waiting for a bunch of things to fall into the ground, including a car, so that he could actually make his Secco's eardrums burst. And then proceeds to go into the typical monologuing thing in JoJo's, where they just explain how they did it, because obviously this is a series where they have to repeatedly explain how they did it. But he then realizes that he actually should probably stop talking, since obviously Seko can't hear him anymore anyway. The monologue is mostly for the audience, and Seko can't even hear him. But of course, Seko points out that obviously just because he can't hear, that obviously he can still hear, and points out that obviously Bucciardi isn't going to be able to run from him. But and then proceeds to remark that he knows exactly where he is. And then proceeds to follow a sound that he thinks is Bucciardi, and proceeds to close the distance, and goes out to go kick whatever he thinks it is, only for his leg to get run over by a car and break. And of course, Seko immediately starts panicking, because he has no idea why he chased the car when he thought it was Bucciardi, and also doesn't quite know where he is. He winds up popping up next to a visitor's kiosk, and he has no idea, and he has absolutely no idea where he is or what's going on. And of course, he immediately starts panicking, pointing out that he doesn't know where Bucciardi is or where he is, and he's trying to figure out why he suddenly just surfaced somewhere where he didn't know where he was or where Bucciardi was. And this is this point where Bucciardi winds up emerging with sticky fingers, and then proceeds to explain that obviously because his eardrums burst, he's not going to be able to hear where he is, and also points out that because of that, his main method of knowing where he was in the ground was through his echolocation, but obviously that's not going to work anymore, and obviously his eardrums have just burst, and of course it's at this point where Bucciardi and Seko just kind of start talking past each other, where of course Bucciardi then proceeds to point out how he's already won, where Seko just kind of outright just announces that he's not going to lose, and also points out that obviously he's not going to let Bucciardi just defeat him, pointing out that obviously he can still go underground and still defeat him that way. But as I said, they're talking past each other. Obviously Bucciardi knows that he's already won, and that Seko isn't going to be able to retreat underground anymore, while Seko is just kind of guessing what Bucciardi is saying and responding to that. And at one point Bucciardi just points out, this is not a very coherent conversation we're having right now. We should probably just get to beating the shit out of each other. But Bucciardi just points it out. Obviously they're rambling incoherently, and obviously they're rambling incoherently to each other without actually hearing each other. So of course Seko points out that he needs to actually beat Bucciardi, and then proceeds to spy. He doesn't realize this in the moment, but he grabs a nearby kid, and it's revealed to be Doppio, and of course it's revealed that Doppio actually wound up getting to Rome, because that's been the thing he's been doing in the background. That is what the boss assigned him to do in the background, and he finally completed that mission. But Seko then proceeds to hold Doppio hostage, not realizing that it's actually Doppio, and he also doesn't realize that he's actually holding his boss hostage right now, and of course he then proceeds, and of course he obviously doesn't get it, so he then proceeds to remark that if Bucciardi gets any closer, he'll kill Doppio, and then proceeds to point out that even if he doesn't wind up defeating Bucciardi, he can't figure out the secret of the Colosseum, and points out that maybe the boss will give him a nice reward, and pointing out that obviously he can only really stay with the group and with the organization, and that he doesn't really know anything else. But and then proceeds to harass Doppio and tell him to hail a taxi, and repeatedly it's just kind of physically abuses him, and even knocks his hat off. And he's wearing a hat, but he knocks his hat off briefly, and insists that Doppio hail a taxi for him. At which point Bucciardi then proceeds to actually close the differences between the two of them, and of course Seko is a little bit bewildered why Bucciardi is still approaching him, pointing out that obviously he's remarked that he's going to kill Doppio if he gets any closer, and even starts melting down, using Oasis to melt into Doppio a little bit to actually show that he's not kidding. But of course he even remarks that obviously Bucciardi's range is only about 2 meters, so if he gets too close, he's not going to be able to beat him. But of course points out that, and of course then proceeds to point out that obviously Bucciardi should just let him go. But it's at this point where Bucciardi then proceeds to punch Doppio, and seemingly punches a hole in him. And of course Seko is and of course it's at this point where Bucciardi walks away, while Seko gloats over the fact that it doesn't seem like he was in Bucciardi's range, but then realizes that Bucciardi had actually used sticky fingers to actually fuse his wrist to his neck, and just and of course realizes too late that that's what happened, and also because of that, And because of that, Seko's body is actually starting to melt as well because because now his throat is melting because Bucciardi had fused his hand to it. But and of course, he quickly realizes that he needs to undo whatever it is this is, and proceeds to stumble around to try and get away from Bucciardi. But in the process, he winds up falling into a dump truck, which is eventually revealed to be the same dump truck that Chocolata was knocked into during his fight. And of course he does seemingly notice Chocolata's body inside the dump truck before being dragged away, and tries to call on him and wake him up. But of course the two of them are just dragged away. Of course, Doppio then points out that obviously he reveals that he actually predicted it with Epitaph, but points out that he didn't need to because he knew Bucciardi wasn't going to kill an innocent kid. He knew even before predicting it that Bucciardi wasn't going to kill him. But and of course, we find out that he's actually completely fine. Bucciardi used sticky fingers to punch a hole through him rather than actually punching him and seemingly killing him. But of course, it's at this point where Bucciardi actually winds up collapsing and finally realizes that he may in fact be at his limit. He finally realizes that he may have run out of time and that his borrowed time is actually finally run out. And of course, Doppio then proceeds to close the distance between the two of them because obviously he's secretly the boss. And realizing that now he has a clear shot at Bucciardi, then proceeds to go and seemingly goes to kill him. So yeah, going into this next episode, it seems that Bucciardi is in a little bit of trouble because he doesn't realize that he's just saved the boss. He doesn't realize that specifically the boss's altar, but he doesn't realize that he's saved the boss, and now the boss is going to kill him before he can complete his mission. And obviously we got Polnareff. There's the mystery with him. I'm curious what kind of life he's been leading. That he's currently wheelchair bound. Obviously he explains that he isn't able to fight anymore. He explains it several times between now and when he was first introduced in Part 5. But he's been just kind of been going off on his own. I'm curious what actually happened to him. Obviously he's wheelchair bound and missing both his legs as well as his eye. I should mention he actually has wearing an eye patch that's stylized to look like his face, which is interesting. But yeah, I am curious what kind of life he's led if he's suffering a little bit of injuries. Obviously his legs were already a mess from when he fought against Dream, but I don't think that would have caused him to lose his legs. I don't think that's what would have happened. But of course he's obviously has several prosthetics now, so I'm interested to see what his story is. But yeah, with that, Chocolate and Seko have actually been defeated. So they're obviously dead. They're not coming back. We're not going to see them again. They've been expertly defeated. We're never going to see them again. But yeah, I am interested to see what exactly it is that Polnareff is going to reveal to the rest of the gang. I'm interested to see what's going to happen next. But for the time being, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out. And you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that are my way of saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Link is down in the description. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So go check both of those out. I have no idea where they're going to send you, so just go check them out and see what comes up and let me know what comes up. But in any case, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.